So the visitors are very real to them.
I like and there seemed to be a little bit of a separation between people that were dying and became fixated on something in the room, and they didn't articulate what it was, but it seemed like a point of light or something that was catching their eye up, say, right around the top of the wall or in the ceiling, and they start being drawn to it, and they might even wordlessly be looking at something, and then they pass on. And then there are those that actually are having conversations with folks in the room. And in some cases, I like that one story about the person, maybe you can tell it better than this, who was telling the visitor in the room, no, I don't want to go yet, because they were still expecting their son to show up.
Isn't that a lovely story? Yes. when one has looked at a lot of these accounts, they do have a pattern to them, and that is that first of all, you're glad to see the person who comes. Then you can, if you are strong enough, you can talk to them. I suspect many people do talk to them, but because they're too weak, we don't know that. But the ones that we do know about, they talk to them and they can negotiate with them. They can say, how are you? And the person who's come, the visitor, will say, I'll be back to you on Tuesday. And the visitor often sets the time of death for them. And if they say they'll be back on Tuesday, then usually the dying person on Tuesday will see them and go with them. So some people, as you mentioned, refuse to go. What they do is they say, please don't come back on Tuesday because I'm not ready to go. And as you mentioned, one of our accounts, this was a son who they were waiting for who's coming from Australia. But we've had a number of accounts of very important things that the dying want to do. And it's usually related to the family. And you can negotiate a little bit with them. But occasionally, people say, I'm not ready to go, I don't want to go away. But I'm afraid they usually go anyway.
It made me think, and it kind of reminded me of the movie Ghost, which illustrates that very same thing in the peaceful, happy way of somebody who's in the process of dying, and then they look up, and then what starts as a beam of light, and then it turns into sort of a wider tunnel of light, and then faces are apparent of people who loved that person, who are there to kind of guide them into the afterworld. But then in the other part of Ghost, the movie, there was this, the belief that if one did not live their life well, that demons would come to them and their last moments of consciousness would be torturous. And it made me wonder whether there's ever any of those examples where somebody who is saying, no, I don't want to go, and they're describing something that is not a heavenly experience, but a hellish one.
Do you know, in all the accounts we had, we didn't have any hellish experiences. The most we had was people not wanting to go, but they were really very few. And they're very few for the reason that you mentioned. We have some wonderful accounts of what the place is like to which they're going. And we have accounts of believers and non-believers. So this is not a question of belief. It seems to be much more a question of fact. And it's something like this. The dying will look up, and sometimes they'll see a light, but sometimes they seem to be able to move into a different reality, and it's composed of love, compassion, and joy. Light is very prominent in it, and it's not too dissimilar to the sort of reality that those in near-death experiences go into. Then the dying are enormously reassured by this. We have some wonderful accounts of people who have seen this lovely, compassionate light as they're dying and talked to their relatives and said, listen, don't be afraid of dying. It's very comforting. And I've seen this light, and I know everything's going to be okay. Now, that's a strange thing to say when you're dying. Everything's going to be okay. But it's what they say. And they say something else, too. And this is a general pattern. The dying never refer to themselves as dying in this last week once the visitors have come. Their whole language changes, and they always talk about going on a journey. Everything becomes a journey. Everything is a movement towards something which is going to happen. When my aunt comes, I will go with her. When grandfather comes and I fall, I'll go with him. Do you see? So the whole language changes, and there's enormous expectation.
I want to amplify something you just said there, though, because you talked about the believers and non-believers.
Yeah.
Can you pull that apart a little bit more and talk about how what your evidence was of people who were not believers in life after death experienced the same thing as people who had always expected that there would be somebody there to greet them to the next experience?
Yes. We have one or two examples like this, and one which stands out in my mind is there was a mother and son, and the son believed that there was life after death, and the mother was firmly against it. She knew that death was the final end. Now, the mother's dying, and the son is at the bedside, and first of all, the mother gets a visit from her dead husband, which unsettles her somewhat. And then, as she starts to die, she sees this light and this area of compassion and love, and she turns to her son and says, "You were right," and then she dies. And that, I think, is a wonderful example of the difference between expectation and belief and the actual experience of dying.
And I think that's a good lead into the expectation that some Christians would have, for example, that Jesus would be there for them, or that there would be a religious figure, a saintly, a well-known religious figure to greet them. But that isn't usually the case, right? I mean, they don't, the appearance of Jesus is not that prominent amongst Christians.
In our sample, and remember, our sample comes from the UK, so most of the people are either Church of England or Catholic in our sample. And many of them don't have very strong beliefs.
Right.
But what we found was that only 3% of our sample saw angels. So angels were really very rare, and we had no reports of religious figures at all. And so what we do now is we come on to this whole question of what culture does. Does culture change the visitors that come for you?
Well,
I think the answer sorry.
Let's hang that up right there, because then we'll come right back to that. That's a great place to stop with that question. How does culture influence the invisible visitors that form a pattern in this research for the book, The Art of Dying? Dr. Peter Fenwick, this is just going to be a terrific time tonight. I can hear it already. There's so many of you who are going to try and get through, and I'll try to open up the phones early for you. The Art of Dying. We'll get into that then. What about India? What about America? How does it change depending on where the person is dying? And then we'll get into what happens to the bereaved in those dreamlike visitations that happen after the person passes. And then later on, what is a good death? Dr. Peter Fenwick on the way on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. The Art of Dying, Dr. Peter Fenwick, neuropsychiatrist and a leading authority on death-related phenomena. Continuing the conversation next, we'll talk about where does culture play a part in who comes to visit when those that are on their deathbed are having their final visions. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Dr. Peter Fenwick was just talking about culture, and so let's pick up there. As you studied not just your own research, but then also sort of collated it with other